The auctioneer had already lifted his gavel when Clara Whitcomb stepped between the crowd and the bidding table. "You can't sell it yet," she said. A few people laughed. Not because she was wrong, because she was talking about a tree. Beyond the rows of dying orchard trees, a single twisted pear tree stood on a low patch of ground, its branches bent by nearly 70 years of storms. The bank's appraisers had marked it as worthless. The developer waiting to buy the land had never even walked close enough to touch it. But now an elderly woman was crying. A university expert had gone completely silent, and the bank manager who had pushed hardest for the auction suddenly looked as though he wished the day had never begun. All because of one forgotten tree. Before we go back to the beginning of this story, take a moment to tell us where you're watching from and what time it is in your part of the world. Whether you're on a farm road, in a small town, or somewhere far from the countryside, we'd love to hear from you. And if stories about family farms, forgotten wisdom, and second chances still mean something to you, consider subscribing before we continue. 3 months before the auction, Whitcomb Orchard sat quietly on the edge of Briar Hollow, Missouri. In spring, the hills around Denton County usually carried the soft colors of new growth. But from the county road, Whitcomb Orchard looked tired. Several rows of aging pear trees leaned at uneven angles. Empty patches marked places where disease and storms had taken trees over the years. The white paint on the barn had long since faded into a dull gray. Even the wooden sign at the entrance hung slightly crooked. Most people who drove past saw only a farm nearing its end. Clara Whitcomb saw something different. Every morning before sunrise, she walked the orchard with a metal bucket and a pair of pruning shears that had once belonged to her father. She knew which trees still produced fruit. She knew where the soil held moisture after a dry week. She knew which branches needed support before summer winds arrived. The orchard had been in her family for nearly 70 years. Her grandfather planted the first rows after returning home from military service. Her father expanded the operation through decades of hard work. For many years, school buses brought children to the orchard every fall. Families came from neighboring counties to fill baskets with fruit. Those days felt very far away now. After her father's long illness and mounting medical bills, debt slowly wrapped itself around the farm like a tightening wire fence. Clara had spent years trying to hold everything together. Some seasons were decent. Some were disasters. The orchard survived one drought, 2 damaging freezes, and more equipment repairs than she cared to count. But survival wasn't the same thing as recovery. By late winter, Denton County Savings Bank had delivered the final notice. Unless the debt was paid, the property would be auctioned. Clara kept that letter folded inside a kitchen drawer, hidden beneath old receipts and seed catalogs. She rarely looked at it. She didn't need to. The weight of it followed her everywhere. One cold afternoon, as she finished trimming a row near the southern edge of the orchard, her eyes drifted toward an old pear tree standing alone beyond the main planting blocks. Most people barely noticed it. Its trunk was twisted. Its branches looked uneven. A rusted aluminum tag still hung from one limb, nearly swallowed by decades of growth. Her father had always treated that tree differently. And just before he died, he had spoken one sentence that Clara had never fully understood. "Some trees don't bear every year," he told her, "but they remember." Standing there in the cold wind, Clara found herself staring at that forgotten tree once again. And for the first time in years, she began to wonder what her father had meant. The next Saturday, Clara drove into town for supplies. Briar Hollow wasn't much more than a grain elevator, a diner, a feed store, and a handful of businesses clustered around the courthouse square. It was the kind of place where people noticed when someone bought a new truck and remembered when someone lost one. That morning, several conversations stopped when Clara entered the feed store. Nobody said anything cruel. They didn't have to. Everyone already knew about the auction. Everyone knew Denton County Savings Bank planned to sell Whitcomb Orchard in less than 3 months. Clara collected a bag of fertilizer and headed toward the counter. "How are you holding up?" asked Elsie Morrow. The elderly woman had lived next to the orchard for nearly 40 years. She remembered Clara's grandfather and often claimed she knew more about local history than the county archives. "I'm still here," Clara answered. Elsie smiled gently. Sometimes that's enough. But Clara wasn't sure she believed that anymore. On the drive home, memories followed her down the winding road. She remembered autumn weekends when cars lined both sides of the orchard entrance. She remembered her father laughing while children filled baskets beneath the trees. She remembered harvest festivals, pie contests, and neighbors gathering beneath strings of lights hung between the barns. Back then, Whitcomb Orchard had been one of the proudest places in the county. Now many of those same neighbors quietly expected it to disappear. That evening, her younger brother Daniel arrived with his 8-year-old daughter Lily. Daniel walked through the kitchen carrying concern he rarely tried to hide. "You got another letter from the bank?" he asked. Clara nodded. He sat heavily at the table. "Maybe it's time to think about selling before the auction." The words hit harder than she expected. "You sound like Martin Vale." "No," Daniel replied. "Martin sees numbers. I see my sister working herself into the ground." Clara looked away. Part of her knew he wasn't entirely wrong. The orchard had taken almost everything she had. Money, sleep, relationships, years of her life. Yet the thought of letting it go felt impossible. While the adults talked, Lily wandered outside. A few minutes later, she came running back toward the house carrying a small pear. "Look what I found." The fruit was oddly shaped. Too small for commercial sale. Its skin carried patches of gold and green, unlike the other pears in the orchard. Clara immediately recognized where it had come from. The old tree. The forgotten one. Lily held it to her nose. "It smells different." Clara took the pear and paused. The scent was unusually sweet, almost floral. For a brief moment, a memory surfaced. Her grandfather standing beside that same tree. Her father carefully wrapping fruit in paper, visitors asking questions. Then the memory vanished before she could fully grasp it. Later that evening, as the sun dropped behind the hills, Clara walked back toward the old pear tree. The rusted aluminum tag still hung from one branch. Wind moved softly through the orchard. For reasons she couldn't explain, she reached out and touched the weathered trunk. Something about the tree felt important. Not valuable. Not yet. Important. And as she stood there, another question entered her mind. If this tree meant so much to her father and grandfather, why had they never told her why? The following week, the people from Denton County Savings Bank arrived just after sunrise. Clara saw their vehicles coming long before they reached the orchard. A white pickup carrying Martin Vale rolled through the front gate, followed by an SUV belonging to Ross Kincaid, the appraiser hired to evaluate the property. Ross looked younger than Clara expected. He carried a tablet computer, a drone case, and enough measuring equipment to survey half the county. "We won't take long," Martin said politely. Clara simply nodded. She had learned that arguments rarely changed paperwork. For the next several hours, Ross moved through the orchard collecting data. The drone buzzed overhead like a giant insect. It photographed tree rows, It measured spacing. It mapped soil conditions. It calculated production estimates based on canopy size and recent yields. Everything looked impressive. Everything looked precise. Yet Clara couldn't shake the feeling that something important was being missed. At one point, Ross stopped near a dying row of pear trees. Most commercial operators would remove this entire section, he said. They're old, Clara replied. They still produce. Not enough. The answer came quickly. Too quickly. Ross entered more numbers into his tablet. By noon, they reached the southern edge of the property. The old pear tree stood alone beyond the main production blocks. Ross barely glanced at it. What about that one? Clara asked. The appraiser looked up. That tree? Yes. He shrugged. Non-commercial. Then he turned and continued walking. The dismissal bothered Clara more than she expected. Martin noticed. You think we're missing something? Clara hesitated. She didn't have evidence. She barely had a feeling. Still, she answered honestly. Maybe. Ross smiled politely. The numbers tell a pretty clear story. That afternoon, the appraisal meeting took place inside the bank. The conference room smelled faintly of coffee and printer toner. Martin sat across from Clara with a thick folder open in front of him. Ross presented photographs, charts, and projected revenue estimates. The conclusion arrived with brutal simplicity. Whitcomb Orchard was classified as commercially distressed. Current market value was far lower than Clara had hoped. Far lower than the debt she owed. The room felt smaller with every page Ross turned. Finally, Martin folded his hands. Unless another solution appears, we'll proceed with the auction. The words landed like a stone. Not because Clara hadn't expected them, because hearing them aloud made the threat real. Outside the bank, neighbor Pete Larkin leaned against his truck. He had apparently heard the news already. Small towns worked that way. Sorry to hear it, Pete said. Then, after a pause, he added, Truth is, most folks figured it was coming. Clara forced a nod. Pete wasn't trying to be cruel. That somehow made it worse. By the time she returned home, the sun was setting behind the orchard. The old pear tree stood in silhouette against the fading sky. The rusted aluminum tag glinted briefly in the evening light. For a moment, she remembered something else. Her father walking toward the tree, carrying a wooden box. A box he always kept locked. A box she had not seen in years. Suddenly, her pulse quickened. She knew exactly where that box used to be. In the back corner of the equipment shed, and if it was still there, it might contain answers no appraisal report ever could. The equipment shed smelled of old wood, machine oil, and decades of seasons trapped beneath a tin roof. The morning after the appraisal meeting, Clara unlocked the door and stepped inside. Dust floated through narrow beams of sunlight. Most of the machinery had not moved in years. A worn Ford tractor sat beneath a canvas cover. Shelves held jars of bolts, faded seed catalogs, and tools her father had collected over a lifetime. Near the back wall stood an old wooden cabinet. For a moment, Clara wasn't sure it was the one she remembered. Then she saw the brass lock. The same lock. Her pulse quickened. She reached into her coat pocket and removed the small key she had found weeks earlier among her father's belongings. The key slid into place. The lock clicked. Inside the cabinet sat a weathered wooden box. Carefully, Clara lifted the lid. The contents looked ordinary at first. Old photographs, receipts, handwritten notes, several folded maps. Then she found a thick ledger bound in cracked brown leather. Her grandfather's orchard ledger. She carried it into the farmhouse and spent the afternoon turning fragile pages. Every year of the orchard's history seemed to live inside that book. Planting dates, weather records, harvest yields, hand-drawn sketches, notes written in careful handwriting. Hours passed. Then something caught her attention. A symbol. A small, hand-drawn bell. The symbol appeared beside a tree marked only as BP-17. Clara sat up straighter. She had seen that bell before, on the rusted aluminum tag hanging from the old pear tree. She turned more pages. There it was again. BP-17. Bell pear. Preserve at all costs. The words had been underlined twice. A chill moved through her. Why would her grandfather single out one tree? The answer seemed to appear several pages later. A newspaper clipping had been carefully folded between two entries. The headline was faded, but still readable. Denton County Harvest Fair winner, Whitcomb Orchard. The photograph showed her grandfather standing beside a display of pears. A ribbon hung from a crate. Beneath the image, a caption mentioned a rare variety known locally as bell pear. Clara stared at the clipping. She had never heard anyone mention that variety. Not once. Not even her father. As evening approached, she drove into town and walked into Denton County Savings Bank, carrying copies of the ledger pages. Martin Vale listened patiently while she explained. When she finished, he leaned back in his chair. "It's interesting history," he admitted. "But history doesn't change market value. This tree may be different." Maybe? Martin paused. But a handwritten note from 70 years ago isn't enough to stop an auction. The disappointment hit harder than Clara expected. She gathered her papers and stood. As she turned toward the door, a bank employee named Ruth Ann Pike quietly glanced at the copies. Something about the ledger seemed to catch her attention, especially the signature near the bottom of one page. Clara noticed the look, but said nothing. Back home. She continued searching through the ledger late into the night. Then she discovered something strange. Several pages in the middle section had been torn out. Not damaged, removed, deliberately. And judging by the page numbers, the missing section should have contained the detailed records for bell pear. Someone, sometime in the past, had taken those pages. The question was why? And who had wanted that information hidden badly enough to remove it from the family record? Word traveled quickly through Denton County. Within days, people were talking about Clara's mystery pear tree. Most of them didn't take the idea seriously. By the time Clara attended the monthly agricultural extension meeting at the county fairgrounds, several people were already smiling before she even sat down. The gathering brought together farmers, orchard owners, county agents, and agricultural advisors from across the region. Clara carried a cardboard box containing several pears from the old tree and a few carefully cut grafting branches. She felt nervous the moment she entered, not because she doubted the tree, because she knew what failure would look like. When her turn came, she explained everything she had discovered: the ledger, the bell pear name, the newspaper clipping, the missing pages. Several people listened politely. Others exchanged doubtful looks. Finally, a young horticultural consultant examined the fruit. He turned one pear over in his hands. "It's unusual," he admitted. "But unusual doesn't mean valuable." The room grew quieter. The samples aren't enough to verify a rare variety. Clara felt her stomach tighten. What would be enough? We'd need stronger documentation, genetic comparison, historical records. something more than family notes. The answer wasn't cruel. It was simply practical, which somehow hurt more. From the back row, Pete Larkin chuckled. The sound carried farther than he intended. "So, we're saving the orchard with one crooked pear tree now." A few people laughed. Not loudly, just enough. The kind of laughter people use when they think reality has already settled the matter. Clara's face grew warm. For a moment, she considered walking out. The old embarrassment returned. The same feeling she had carried for years whenever neighbors discussed how far Whitcomb Orchard had fallen. When the meeting ended, she loaded the box back into her truck. Most people drifted away. Only County Extension Agent Maribel Shaw approached her. Maribel was older than the consultant and had spent most of her career working directly with growers. She picked up one of the pears. The fruit had begun to soften. Still, she seemed interested. "This scent is unusual," she said quietly. "You noticed it too." Maribel nodded. "I did." For the first time that day, Clara felt a small spark of hope. Then she watched as Maribel carefully cut a tiny section from one of the grafting branches. "You mind if I keep this?" "What for?" "I'd like to look into something." It wasn't a promise, but it wasn't dismissal either. That evening a storm rolled across Denton County. Heavy rain hammered the orchard, wind bent branches and rattled the farmhouse windows. Near midnight, a sharp cracking sound echoed through the darkness. The next morning, Clara hurried outside. Her heart sank. One of the largest limbs on the old bell pear tree had broken away. Fresh wood gleamed where the branch had split. The damage looked severe. Then she noticed something strange. Embedded deep inside the exposed trunk was a small strip of metal. Not part of the tree. Not a nail. Something deliberately placed there long ago. As rainwater dripped from the broken wood, Clara reached toward the hidden object. Whatever it was, it had been concealed inside that tree for decades. And now, for the first time, it was finally visible. Clara did not pull the metal strip out right away. The old tree had already lost one heavy limb, and she was afraid one wrong movement might tear the wound wider. Instead, she called Elsie Morrow. By noon, the elderly woman arrived wearing a raincoat and carrying a magnifying glass in her coat pocket, as if she had been waiting half her life for someone to ask about the old orchard. Elsie studied the exposed trunk carefully. "That wasn't put there by accident," she said. Clara held the broken limb steady while Elsie worked the metal loose with the tip of a pocket knife. It came free, covered in dark sap and rust. When Clara wiped it clean, faint letters appeared. Hollow Creek Nursery. Below that was a small stamped bell. Elsie's expression changed. "I remember that name." Clara looked up. "The nursery." Elsie nodded slowly. "Closed before you were born. But your grandfather traded grafts with them. Folks used to say he had trees nobody else in the county could keep alive." Clara turned the strip over in her palm. It felt too small to carry so much weight. But there it was. Another bell. Another link. Another sign that BP-17 had meant something. That evening, Clara called Maribel Shaw and described what they had found. Maribel listened without interrupting. Then she said, "If you can send me a clean graft sample, the old tag, and photographs of that nursery marker, I can forward them to someone at the university. How long would it take? I can't promise anything." Clara closed her eyes. The auction date was already moving toward her like weather on the horizon. "I need more than maybe." "I know," Maribel said softly. But maybe is better than nothing. The testing would cost money Clara did not have. Shipping samples properly would cost money too, and there were still fees tied to the auction process. That night, she sat at the kitchen table with bills spread before her. The farmhouse was silent except for the refrigerator humming in the corner. By morning, she had made the decision she had been avoiding. She called Harper and Sons Equipment and asked if they still bought used tractors. 2 days later, a man from the dealership came to look at her father's old Ford. The tractor had faded blue paint, a cracked seat, and one stubborn gear that had to be coaxed into place. But it still started. When the engine turned over, Clara had to look away. Daniel stood beside her in the driveway. "You don't have to do this," he said. "Yes," Clara answered. "I do." The buyer counted out less money than the tractor deserved, and more money than Clara had anywhere else. When the trailer pulled away, the empty space in the shed looked larger than it should have. Lily slipped her small hand into Clara's. "Grandpa's tractor is gone." Clara swallowed hard. "For now," she said, though she knew that was not true. That afternoon, she packed the graft samples, photographs, and copies of the ledger pages. Before sealing the box, she added one small pear Lily had found drying on the windowsill. Then, just as she returned from the post office, Martin Vale's truck pulled into the yard. He stepped out with a folder in his hand. "I'm sorry, Clara," he said. Her stomach tightened before he spoke again. "The auction has been moved up 10 days. For the first time since her father's death, Clara seriously considered giving up. Not because she no longer believed in the orchard, because time was running out faster than hope could keep pace. The auction date now sat less than 3 weeks away. Every morning she woke up thinking about it. Every night she fell asleep wondering whether the bell pear tree mattered at all. Meanwhile, the rest of Briar Hollow seemed to have already moved on. The reason arrived one Tuesday afternoon in the form of a polished black SUV. The vehicle belonged to Cresswell Storage Group. Its owner, Nolan Cresswell, had spent years buying farmland near highways and turning it into storage facilities, trucking yards, and distribution centers. To many people, he represented growth, jobs, tax revenue, opportunity. To Clara, he represented bulldozers. Nolan toured the orchard with Martin Vale and several town officials. The group walked across the property while Clara watched from a distance. By evening, everyone in town knew the rumors. Cresswell intended to bid aggressively at the auction. The location was ideal. The county road connected directly to the interstate. The orchard itself didn't interest him. The land did. A week later, Nolan attended a town council meeting. His presentation was polished, professional, convincing. He described construction jobs, future tax revenue, infrastructure improvements. Many residents liked what they heard. Even people who sympathized with Clara began questioning whether preserving an old orchard made sense. Afterward, Clara overheard part of a conversation outside the building. "It's sad about Whitcomb Orchard," one man said, "but maybe this is what the town needs." The words followed her all the way home. That night, Daniel visited again. This time, he didn't argue. He simply sat beside her on the porch. For several minutes, neither of them spoke. Finally, Daniel broke the silence. "Did you hear from the university?" "No." "And Maribel?" "Nothing yet." The answer felt heavier each time she repeated it. Daniel stared toward the dark orchard. You know, he said quietly, Dad would have fought. Clara laughed bitterly. Dad would have known what to do. No, Daniel replied. He would have been scared too. The statement surprised her. For years, she had remembered their father as larger than life. Steady, certain, strong. Daniel shook his head. He just never let us see it. The conversation lingered with her long after he left. Maybe courage wasn't certainty. Maybe it was continuing while uncertain. 2 days later, another surprise arrived. Ruth Ann Pike called from the bank. Her voice sounded unusually cautious. Clara, I found something. What kind of something? A file? Ruth Ann paused. Actually, several files. Clara sat upright. The bank employee lowered her voice. They're old mortgage records from the 1960s. Your grandfather's name is on them. Clara's heart began to race. What did they say? I don't want to discuss it over the phone. Silence stretched between them. Then Ruth Ann added the words Clara would remember for years. You need to come here tonight. What did you find? Another pause. Finally, Ruth Ann answered. Something that suggests your orchard may be worth a lot more than anyone realizes. Ruth Ann waited until the bank had closed for the evening. The lights inside Denton County Savings Bank were dim, and most of the staff had already gone home. When Clara arrived, Ruth Ann led her into a records room hidden behind a locked door. Metal shelves stretched from floor to ceiling. Boxes filled with decades of documents lined the walls. I wasn't looking for this, Ruth Ann said. I was searching old foreclosure records. She opened a weathered file and carefully slid several papers onto the table. The first document carried her grandfather's signature. The second carried the bank's seal. The third made Clara stop breathing for a moment. Across the top were the words, Heritage Orchard Block. Clara stared. What is this? A special valuation agreement. Ruth Ann pointed to a section highlighted in faded blue ink. According to the document, a portion of Whitcomb Orchard had once been classified separately because it contained historically significant heirloom varieties. One variety had been listed by name. Bell pear. The room fell silent. For several seconds, Clara could only stare at the page. This was filed with the bank. Ruth Ann nodded. In 1964. Then why wasn't it included in the appraisal? Because nobody knew it existed. The answer sounded unbelievable. Yet the file was right there. Decades earlier, the agreement had been attached to a mortgage renewal. Over time, it had been misfiled and forgotten. Just like the tree. Just like the orchard itself. Clara's hands trembled as she turned another page. A map appeared. The outline matched the southern section of the property. Exactly where the old bell pear tree stood. Then something else happened. Ruth Ann's office phone rang. She answered, listened, then covered the receiver. It's Maribel. Clara grabbed the phone. Maribel sounded excited, more excited than Clara had ever heard her. The preliminary results came back. What did they find? The genetic markers are unusual. Unusual how? A brief pause followed. We think the bell pear may be connected to a heritage variety believed lost nearly 50 years ago. Clara closed her eyes. For a moment, she could hardly speak. Think. That's the problem. Maribel's voice became more cautious. We need confirmation. The words brought reality rushing back. What kind of confirmation? A direct inspection. A university pomology specialist had agreed to visit. The expert would arrive the morning of the auction. The timing couldn't have been worse, or better. After hanging up, Clara sat quietly. The evidence was growing stronger. The ledger, the nursery marker, the mortgage file, the map, the genetic testing. Yet none of it had officially changed anything. The auction remained scheduled. The developer remained committed. The bank remained legally entitled to proceed. Outside, snow flurries drifted through the parking lot lights. For the first time in weeks, Clara felt hope. But hope came with a terrible risk. If the expert arrived and disagreed, if the evidence proved incomplete, if the Bell pair turned out to be merely unusual instead of extraordinary, then she would lose everything. As she drove home, Daniel called. She told him what Ruth Ann had found. For a long moment he said nothing. Then he surprised her. "I'm coming to the auction." Clara smiled faintly. "You don't have to." "Yeah," Daniel replied. "I think I do." The next morning, the county posted auction signs at the front entrance of Whitcomb Orchard. And as Clara stood beside the old Bell pear tree, watching workers hammer the signs into the frozen ground, she noticed a line of headlights approaching from the highway. The university expert was finally on the way. But so were the bidders. By 9 o'clock that morning, Whitcomb Orchard looked less like a farm and more like a courthouse yard. Trucks lined both sides of the county road. Neighbors stood near the barn in heavy coats, speaking in low voices. Bidders gathered around folding tables where auction papers were stacked in neat piles. At the front stood Nolan Cresswell, calm and confident, his hands tucked into the pockets of a dark wool coat. Martin Vale moved between the auctioneer and the bank's attorney, trying to keep everything orderly. Clara stood near the old Bell pear tree. Daniel stood beside her. For the first time in years, she did not feel completely alone. The auctioneer began with a clear voice that carried across the frozen ground. The first bids came quickly. Too quickly. Nolan raised his number without hesitation. Another buyer joined briefly, then dropped out. Within minutes, the price climbed beyond anything Clara could challenge. Every bid sounded like a door closing. Then a small blue sedan turned into the orchard entrance. Maribel Shaw stepped out first. Behind her came a gray-haired woman carrying a leather satchel and a long pruning knife. Clara knew immediately. The university expert. Doctor. Helen Ward walked straight toward the old pear tree. But the auctioneer did not stop. Nolan raised his number again. The crowd murmured. Clara stepped forward. "Wait." The auctioneer glanced at Martin. Martin's jaw tightened. "Clara, this is not the time." "It is exactly the time." People turned. Pete Larkin gave a soft laugh from the crowd, but this time it died quickly. "Doctor." Ward examined the tree without speaking. She looked at the aluminum tag, then the exposed nursery marker, then the broken limb. Maribel handed her copies of the ledger, the old mortgage file, and the map Ruth Ann had found. For several long minutes, the only sounds were paper rustling and wind moving through dead grass. Finally, "Doctor." Ward looked up. "Who grafted this tree?" Clara swallowed. "My grandfather." "Doctor." Ward studied the trunk again. "This is not just an old pear tree." The crowd fell quiet. Even Nolan lowered his bid card. "Doctor." Ward continued, her voice careful but firm. "The fruit sample, the grafting marker, the bell symbol, and these records all point to the same conclusion." Martin stared at her. "What conclusion?" "Doctor." Ward touched the old trunk gently. "This may be one of the last living mother trees of the Bell pear line. Possibly the only one still rooted where it was originally grown." No one laughed now. Maribel added that the genetic markers matched known descriptions from archived agricultural records. Ruth Ann stepped forward with the bank file in her hands. And the bank has a record classifying this section as a heritage orchard block. Martin's face changed, not with anger, with realization, the kind that arrives too late and lands heavily. The auctioneer lowered his gavel. Mr. Vale. Every person in the orchard seemed to look at the bank manager at once. Martin glanced from the legal papers to the old tree, then to Clara. For the first time since the foreclosure began, he did not look certain. And Clara understood that the entire future of Whitcomb Orchard now rested on what he chose to say next. The silence seemed to stretch across the entire orchard. No one moved. No one spoke. Even the auctioneer waited. Martin Vale looked down at the documents in his hands one final time. Then he closed the folder. Slowly, carefully, as though he understood that whatever happened next would follow him for a long time. The auction is suspended. A wave of whispers swept through the crowd. Nolan Cresswell's expression hardened. You can't be serious. Martin turned toward him. Under these circumstances, I don't have much choice. The property was legally listed. Maybe. Martin glanced toward Dr. Ward. But the valuation appears incomplete. For several seconds, nobody spoke again. Then Clara felt something she had not experienced in months. The pressure on her chest began to ease. Not disappear, just ease. The auctioneer lowered his gavel completely. It's postponed pending review. The crowd slowly broke into conversation. Some looked shocked. Others looked embarrassed. A few simply stared at the bell pear tree as if seeing it for the first time. Pete Larkin removed his hat. Well, he muttered, guess that old tree had something to say after all. A week later, representatives from the university returned. So did specialists from a heritage fruit preservation organization. Within a month, they confirmed what Dr. Ward had suspected. The bell pear was one of the last surviving mother trees of a nearly vanished American heirloom variety. Researchers requested grafting rights. Preservation groups offered support. A specialty orchard cooperative expressed interest in future propagation. For the first time in years, Whitcomb Orchard possessed something no modern commercial orchard could easily replace: history. The bank eventually agreed to restructure part of Clara's debt, not because of sympathy, because the orchard's value had changed, reality had changed. Still, victory came with a price. The old Ford tractor was gone. The roadside acreage nearest the highway had to be sold to satisfy a portion of the loan, and many repairs remained beyond Clara's budget. Some mornings she still worried about money. Some nights she still lay awake. Life had not become easy, only possible. By spring, new grafts from the bell pear were growing inside a small nursery section near the barn. One afternoon, Lily helped hang a painted wooden bell on the fence near the original tree. The old aluminum tag remained on the branch above it. Weathered, crooked, unremarkable to anyone who didn't know the story. Clara stood beneath the tree as sunlight filtered through fresh leaves. For a moment she remembered her father's words. Some trees don't bear every year, but they remember. Now she finally understood. The tree had remembered. The ledger had remembered. The land had remembered, even when people had forgotten. Across the orchard, workers prepared rows for another season. The future remained uncertain. The debt was not completely gone. The orchard was not suddenly prosperous, but Whitcomb Orchard was still standing. And for Clara, That was enough. Stories like Clara Whitcomb stay with us because most of us have known something or someone that others gave up on too soon. Maybe it was a family farm. Maybe it was a small business. Maybe it was a person who carried quiet value that the world overlooked. The bell pear tree wasn't important because it was rare. It was important because someone cared enough to protect it, long before anyone understood why. That kind of faith doesn't always make headlines. Most of the time, it looks ordinary. It looks like getting up before sunrise, holding on when the numbers say not to, remembering something others forgot, and believing that not everything valuable can be measured immediately. If this story reminded you of someone in your own life, we'd love to hear about them. Have you ever known a person who was underestimated? Someone who stayed patient while everyone else doubted them? Share their story in the comments. And if you haven't already, tell us where you're watching from and what time it is in your corner of the world. One of the best parts of this community is seeing people gather from small towns, farm roads, cities, and countries all across the map. If you enjoyed spending time in Briar Hollow and walking through Whitcomb Orchard with us, consider leaving a like and subscribing for more stories about rural America, forgotten wisdom, family farms, and the people who refuse to quit when quitting would be easier. Until next time, take care of yourselves, take care of each other, and remember that sometimes the most important things in life are the ones that seem forgotten.